Welcome to the Answer Zone. You ask your questions, I do my best to give you answers. And as always, remember, this is not medical advice. If you want medical advice, go talk with your doctor. I'm just trying to help you navigate the world of nutrition. And so that being said, let's dive in. Tiffany writes in with this question: can a reaction be just itching with no rash? In other words, she's talking about food reactions. I recently started eating Greek yogurt and my entire legs and arms have been driving me nuts with itching. I stopped eating it and the itching has stopped. And so the simple answer is yes. And you can eat a food and if you're reactive to that food, you can get a histamine response. And a histamine response can cause a rash, but it can also cause itching. And it can cause both at the same time. So, just itching is definitely a sign of potential for food allergy, and it's one of the ways that your body's going to communicate to you, stop eating that food. So Julie writes in asking, she says, I have a supplement with rice hull, but I'm also positive for gluten-sensitive genes. Am I right to assume that I need to avoid this supplement with rice hull in it? The answer, Julie, in my opinion, is yes. Even though rice is going to be, technically labeled as a gluten-free filler, there is a type of gluten in rice called orzonin, and many people react to it. So for somebody with gluten sensitivity, rice-based fillers are not the best thing to consume because it can create low-grade reactions that can create chronic and perpetual inflammation when you're trying to recover. Now that also being said, rice is lowest in gluten of all the grains. So if we look at, wheat, having 69% of the protein found in wheat is a gluten, whereas 5% of the protein found in rice is gluten. So it's definitely lower, but that orzonin can be tricky and it can be inflammatory. And if you're not sure, but you're gluten reactive, it's best to avoid that rice. And below this, I'm going to put a more comprehensive article and video for you that goes a little bit more in depth about the whys of why you should avoid rice. Thanks for writing in your question. Jennifer writes in, how can one test negative for celiac disease, negative for wheat allergy, but always react when eating gluten? Is it glyphosate? So that's really two questions. Let's unpack it. Number one, if you're testing for celiac disease, know that there's a huge potential for those lab tests to give false negatives, meaning that you could get a negative test result, but you actually do react to gluten. And one of the reasons why is those tests are based on measuring antibodies. Many celiacs and many non-celiac gluten-sensitive individuals have antibody deficiencies. And so what can happen is you're using this test that's measuring antibodies, but because you have an antibody deficiency, the test comes back not showing a positive reaction, not because you're not reacting, but because you don't make enough antibodies for the test to detect the reaction that you're having. So that's one flaw. Then we have the biopsy test that many GI doctors will run, that biopsy to look for villus atrophy that's caused by celiac. Remember, not all people with gluten reactions develop villus atrophy. So if you come back and you're negative on your biopsy, it doesn't mean you're not reacting to gluten. It just means that the biopsy you had done didn't show villus atrophy. That's really all it means. Now, there's also another caveat to that, and that is your small intestine has the surface area of a tennis court. So it's very vast. And a biopsy of a few locations of that vast surface area of your small intestine is not an accurate representation of the entire surface area. So you can actually get a biopsy that's falsely negative, not because you don't have damage, but because where the doctor took the specimens didn't show any damage. So there's another, again, just one of the flaws or one of the downfalls of testing for celiac disease directly. This is why I always recommend genetic testing. Genetic testing, number one, you don't have to be eating gluten to do it. Number two, it will never change. You either have the genes that will predispose you to react to gluten or you don't. And so understanding that gives you kind of an ability to make a great decision about whether or not changing your diet to a gluten-free variety is the right move for you for the long haul. Now, some of you are saying, well, if gluten hurts, I'm just going to change my diet anyway. And that's great. You can do that too. But what happens to many, in my experience, is they go gluten-free for 6 months, maybe a year, and then social pressure draws them back in and pulls them right back over to the dark side of gluten, right? So, you go to a holiday party, you go out with friends, you go to a restaurant, and little by little, gluten starts to creep back into your diet. And remember that if you are gluten sensitive and you continue to eat gluten, you have a fourfold increased risk of mortality as a result of doing that. So literally you're playing with your life if you allow that gluten to sneak back in slowly over time. So genetic testing is where it's at. The other tests can detect it, but there are flaws where you can get false negatives.